Hi, welcome to the second of the dialogues towards integrated observing and forecasting ocean boundary systems. This is presented by the Ocean Observations Physics and Climate panel of Goose. And I want to thank Forrest Collins and Marjolaine Krug and Belaine Miguel Martinez for organizing this. My name is Ed Dever. I'm going to be the moderator for today's dialogue, along with Janet Sprinthal. I'm at Oregon State University. Janet's at UCSD Scripps Oceanography. We're really excited and thankful to welcome Katherine Zaba and Chris Edwards, who are going to be speaking about California current observations and California current modeling, respectively. As I mentioned, this is intended to be a dialogue. It's intended to be interactive. You know, there are limitations to how we can interact by a webinar system, but hopefully everybody's had a chance to view the talks that Kasia and Chris have prepared and think about some questions. The format is that after my introduction, Janet's going to introduce Kasia. Kasia will give a 5-minute kind of overview or summary of her talk. I will then introduce Chris. Chris will give a 5-minute overview or summary of his talk. We'll have about 20 minutes of what we're calling guided discussion. So the Boundary Systems task team has prepared questions in advance, and we're going to kind of key off of some of those questions for Kasia and Chris. But you also have the opportunity to submit questions through the question box during the 5-minute overview talks. And so please do submit questions. Janet and I are going to be monitoring those questions. And after we kind of finish up with sort of a guided discussion, then we're going to work towards the unguided discussion, and hopefully we'll sort of have 20 minutes or so of guided discussion, 25 minutes of unguided discussion. And then at the end of the hour, we'll wrap things up and describe the next upcoming talks, which are also shown on the Goose website if you go to webinars. So I guess without too much further ado here, let me go ahead and end my presentation mode. I'll make Kasia the presenter, and Janet, you can go ahead and introduce Kasia's talk. Let's see here.
How about that? That's better, isn't it? Yes, it's my pleasure today to introduce Kasia Zaba. Kasia was a graduate student. She did her PhD at Scripps, so I got to know her a little bit there, so that was great. But now she's the Director of Glider Programs at MRV Systems. And so that's a wonderful promotion for you, Kasia. And your research interests include oceanic boundary currents, ENSO variability, and of course, autonomous underwater gliders. So most of her research has been regionally focused on the California current system, with contributions to the California Underwater Glider Network, the CUGN, and the California Current Ecosystem Long-Term Ecological Research Project, among others. So we're very happy to have you here today, Kasia, to tell us more about the observational system within the California current system. Thanks very much.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you, Janet, and thank you all for having me. We'll go ahead and jump right in to the summary of the observations talk for today. So just a reminder as to what the California current system is and why we care. Here's a little map on the left. In the alongshore, there's a lot of surface and subsurface, or there are several surface and subsurface currents that flow alongshore. These currents transport different temperature, salinity, biogeochemical properties, so we care about the meridional heat transport along the coast of the US here, along with salt transport and transport of other tracers as well. And there's a convergence of subarctic waters coming down from the north and tropical water masses coming up from the south. So you can imagine this is an interesting region where multiple water masses are meeting and interacting. In the vertical, we care about the wind-driven upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich waters. This upwelling process maintains our mild coastal weather. We, at least in the southern portion of the system, tend to have dry summers and mild winters. So you can imagine it would be different if the physics of the ocean were different offshore. And second, this upwelling also drives our biologically productive ecosystem. As you can see here, this is satellite derived chlorophyll. The more green you see, the more chlorophyll there is. And so this is just very general. Couple of the things we care about. There's obviously a lot more we care about with respect to physics of the California current system, but kind of another layer on all of this is that there's a lot of spatiotemporal variability to everything mentioned here and things not mentioned here too. So it's really important to have observations and assets in the water all the time to understand how things change, you know, from daily to weekly to seasonal to interannual to decadal on all those different time scales. Okay, so because this current system is so vast, we tend to think about it in different regions, or we tend to think about different regions of the California current system. So here we've got northern, central, southern, and in the talk I had broken these down and talked about the different observation networks associated with each of them. So in the north, the northern region for us here is off the coast of Oregon and Washington. The regional observing network is NANUS. There's also OOI, the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which was established in 2015. There are a variety of platforms in the water up in the northern region, from buoys to a cabled seabed to HF radar, gliders, moorings, river gauges, ship-based cruises, and shore stations, among others. In the central and southern region, which spans the large coast of California, central northern California, we have CENCUS and SCUS as the regional observing networks. In addition to that, we have CalCoffee, which has been around for a long time, established in 1949. We also have the California Underwater Glider Network, which leverages the CalCoffee geometry, but does observations in an autonomous way. And that was established in 2005. Many of the same platforms that are up in the northern region are also used in the central and southern region. I think it's important to mention too that offshore there floats, part of the Argo program. There aren't that many, you know, near the coastline or on the shelf, but they are offshore, and it's important to understand. They're important for understanding the interaction between kind of the offshore region and the coastal region, and also satellite products. Well, satellite products go from offshore to inshore, but I think Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, more reliable in the offshore region. All right, and then here's a quick summary slide, kind of providing some context for all the stuff that was discussed, and hopefully this can be used to guide the discussion today. So, summary of a description of the observing system real quick. So as I mentioned, there's a wide mix of complementary platforms. What I mean by that is different platforms measure things at different scales in different places, different variables. And so it's important to have a variety of platforms in the water measuring a variety of different things. Many of the observing systems were designed and deployed for distinct scientific and operational purposes and continue to be run for those purposes. So for example, there are platforms that are specifically meant to monitor weather. CDIP, the network of wave buoys, is its purposes for maritime safety. CalCoffee, of course, for fisheries management. The glider network, the CUGN, is intended to monitor the regional ocean climate. And then there are many platforms out there that are intended to provide data in real time for basic research. And many of these systems have now achieved full sustainment. There are a variety of users. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I think it's important to think about, besides the basic research and the researchers, who is utilizing these data. There have been a variety of successes. I think first and foremost, these observing systems together have been very useful in monitoring environmental variability over the years and decades, up to century. For example, there's been a recent interest in marine heat waves, and so it's important to have assets in the water to measure those events. We've been able to resolve things from the large-scale hydrography of the CCS through to small-scale coastal processes, so at a variety of scales. The data are useful for data assimilation into regional models, and they're also used for validation, and that could be validation of remote obs like satellite observations and also for models. There are some gaps, and we can spend some time discussing this today. There are spatial gaps, for example, within the typical CCS that we think of. Southern Oregon and Northern California are not very well populated with observations. Also, to the south of us, we could use more observations off the coast of Mexico, and we know very well that there is a tropical influence from the south. So, extending the observing networks into Mexican waters would be very useful from a scientific standpoint. There are temporal gaps in that some of the time series are short in length and or sparse. And then across the different observation types, there are mixed sampling schemes, mixed metadata and data formats, and quality control processes. And so that can make it hard to compare or use multiple data sets for the same scientific purpose. Some of the recommendations that we have involve improving the near real-time quality control so that the data could be used in real time, and metadata consistency. So different groups have different ways of doing that, and it'd be nice if it was all consistent and everyone used the same compliance. And that's all I got for today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Kasia. We'll have Ed introduce Chris.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kasia. And yeah, Chris is a professor at the Ocean Sciences Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and his research centers on the development and analysis of regional ocean models and data assimilation for studying ocean circulation, biogeochemistry, and fisheries. His present research focuses on physical and biological interactions within the California current system, the collection of currents off the U.S. West Coast that include both the time mean and temporally variable motions at many scales. So thanks very much, Chris, and go ahead and take it away.
Thanks. I believe you can see my screen right now. Okay. If you can't, please let me know.
I can see it, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I'm showing on this slide is just a collection of models that are for the CCS. There's a large number of them because it's a big coast, and there are a lot of institutions that have regional interests with different foci. And so in the upper right, I'm just showing a set of operational models as model domains, and you can see about 6 different operational models that work on the West Coast. These are in near real time, and all of the ones on the upper right are using the regional ocean modeling system, ROMS, and there's a lot of overlap. They were all developed at different times for different reasons with different emphases, and they are really quite complementary. Although there is a new development, this blue one here, which is also shown on the, excuse me, on the left. Anyway, there are a number of different groups that make these. Some of these involve estuaries and coastal waters, and then others involve the California current as a whole. Some of these span, say, the state of California, like this one here by Yi Chao. Some of them are regional, Southern California. This one from CASE, which uses the MIT GCM that Kasia is involved with. Ours, the one at UC Santa Cruz, covers a large fraction of the west coast of the US, but its main emphasis is on the central coast. And then this one on the left is the latest in the collection of models on the west coast. It's got the largest domain at very high resolution, 4-kilometer resolution, and it extends quite far into Mexico to the south and into British Columbia in the north. And this is now being run operationally as of about 2 months ago at NOAA. This one here developed by Alexander Karapov. So that one is very exciting for the West Coast community. As Kasia mentioned, there are a number of different observations. I'm just listing those here that are particularly useful for data assimilation. We've got sea surface height, sea surface temperature. Argo floats, a fantastic collection of gliders that Kasia is heavily involved with as well. HF radar and repeat shipboard stations. All of these get assimilated into the different models. All right, the data assimilation system works just quickly as follows. There's some model forecast that's made, data comes in. It is, there are discrepancies between the model and the data, and the assimilation machinery finds adjustments to control variables that lead to a new model state called the analysis, which hopefully is closer to the data than the initial model run was. On the West Coast, we tend to use 4D variational assimilation. All of the operational systems are using that, though there are other methods, of course, the Ensemble common filter. That, for some reason, is not widely used on the West Coast, but could be. An example of this is shown. This is for the WCOFS, the West Coast Ocean Forecast System, this newest model on the West Coast. And what it's showing is area averaged alongshore velocity in the upper panel, and the area averaging in this particular case is in the red box here. It's just showing an average alongshore velocity. The observations are in light gray, the prior model estimate is in blue, and the assimilative estimate is in green. And if you look carefully, there are quantitative improvements between the model and the data associated with the 4D VAR assimilation. And you can express this in different ways. The RMS velocity, the RMS error of the velocity is shown in the lower panel. This includes both the longshore and cross-shore currents, and basically the posterior estimate has lower error than the prior. So I'll just lastly finish off with one of the things we like to do is to look at the impact of the observational network to try to assess the value of different observations. And we can do that in the 4D VAR framework for every single observation that comes in, so thousands of pieces of information. But right here, we're just aggregating it by platform. So we look at SST, say SSH, in situ temperature and velocity, and we can show as a time series the impact of each of these platforms on a particular circulation metric. In this case, it's the alongshore transport. If you're interested in, say, meridional heat transport, this might be one metric that would be of interest. In this case, it's the upper ocean transport going down to, I think, 500 meters and going offshore some distance at a latitude of Santa Cruz, where I sit. And you can see that for this particular metric, SST and SSH have the largest bars over time, but the in situ measurements of temperature and salinity also contribute quantitatively in very important ways. And you can find time periods when different platforms are more or less important than others. And of course, this time series changes with different circulation metrics, what you're really going after. All right, so that's mostly what I wanted to present as an introduction. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Let's see here. I thought we'd leave your presentation up, if that's okay, as we go into the questions. And then if we have a question that's really focused on Kasha's, maybe we could flip back to her presentation. Sometimes it's helpful to have some of those figures around to discuss around. And we're starting to get a couple questions in. I think we're going to lead off with kind of the guided discussion. I guess you'd call it the sort of preset group of questions from the boundary system task team members. So everybody, there's lots of opportunity to ask questions. And thanks very much to Uwe's end for kicking the ball off. But we've got plenty of opportunity for folks to ask questions here in a few minutes. I don't know, Janet, how you feel about this. I'm happy to ask the first question, and we can take it from there. If you see one afterwards you're really into, then you can go ahead and ask after that. Does that make sense?
That sounds fine. And we're going to start off with the questions from the task team, right?
That's right. That's right. You can kind of tell we're winging it here, but I'm hoping it's pretty okay. So the first question, and it was initially posed to Kasia, but I think it's a good question for both Kasia and Chris as well, is about atmospheric forcing, right? So for global ocean observing, you know, we're really fortunate to be living in an era where we have a lot of satellite observations, and in the California current, we're also pretty fortunate, those of us that are studying the California current, to have a lot of in situ observations. But having said that, you know, the California current's a classic kind of wind-driven upwelling system. Since it's a wind-driven system, how adequate are the observations in the region, right? So we've got scatterometer observations from satellites, but they don't really resolve the coastal area that well. And I know that, you know, Kasia, in your talk, you did mention that we do have some wind measurements, but I guess first initially to Kasia and then on to Chris. For observational and for modeling purposes, how well would you characterize the wind forcing, including in situ observations of wind forcing? And if you think we need more wind measurements, where do you think we need those? Where's it most important to get those coastal wind measurements that we can't get through scatterometer? So long-winded question. I'm happy to repeat it in a slightly different form, but what are your thoughts, Kasia?
Give it a shot. Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing to have observations in the ocean, you know, at the surface or below subsurface, that you can pair well with an atmospheric data product, given the differences in resolution, sparseness. So, you know, considering in situ wind obs, right? I think there are moorings out there that have them. There are piers that will have, for example, wind measurements, but that is relatively sparse given, you know, the scales of wind variability. So yeah, I don't think there is a perfect wind data product out there for us. I'm going to kind of pass this over to Chris, because I do believe that with the data assimilative models, especially the 4D VAR ones, you guys use atmospheric forcing and then get atmospheric forcing fields back out that might be more realistic than the ones you put in. I don't know if I said that correctly, but I'll tee it off to you.
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, I think the atmospheric forcing is a real issue. It's interesting, when the question first came up, my first thought was not about the wind forcing, but actually about the thermal forcing. So in an eastern boundary upwelling system, low-level marine boundary layer clouds are a real issue and not necessarily well resolved by the atmospheric models. And so there can be biases in the surface heat flux in the California current by some of these models. But you raise an excellent point also about the wind forcing, and there is a network of nearshore buoys that goes up and down the coast. And we, for our model product, we do use a local regional downscaled model, atmospheric model to force ours. And that one takes into account a lot of the local data that is available and is itself assimilative, and it's got high quality output. But yes, there are gaps, and the California current is very strongly wind driven, and I think that is a real issue. Now, as Kasia mentioned, the 40 VAR models can adjust atmospheric forcing as well, and that is something that is done. Actually, it's not in our operational model, but it is in historical reanalyses that we've done back to 1980, and we have updated fluxes, momentum, and heat. It's not clear that those are closer to nature because we don't have much data to show that they're better, but they do provide ocean circulation results that are closer to the observations than without those corrections. So that is another way to get at this, but it's unclear. We don't really have the data to show that they're better.
Thank you, Chris and Kasia. That was pretty interesting. I had thought about, based on the question, mostly about wind forcing, but I think that's a really interesting point about heat fluxes. And I was also pretty interested in the way you had talked about model products going back to the early 1980s, it sounds like. And I guess what I was wondering about is there are a few pieces of data out there from process-oriented field programs in the early 1980s, as well as different times. I think NOAA NDBC has had at least like shortwave radiation sensors occasionally on NDBC buoys. Is that kind of an interesting way to, would that be an interesting way to kind of validate or test these models against some of these pieces of data? I guess I can think about, for example, off of Northern California, the Coastal Ocean Dynamics experiment in the early 1980s had some surface heat fluxes, and the Shelf Mixed Layer experiment in 88, 89 did. And then, like I said, I think there's a scattering of NDBC buoys that had that stuff. Is that a useful approach, do you think? Or is that like, well, this is, they're only there for a few periods of a few months and it's not so useful?
I think that would be useful. In general, those long reanalyses that go back to the 1980s, they're assimilating sea surface temperature initially, and then in the 1990s, of course, sea surface height. There wasn't that much data at that time, and the one-off programs, they were included in the assimilation if they're part of a UK Met Office EN database of global observations. Then we use those for assimilation, in which case they wouldn't be that good for evaluation. But the heat flux measurements directly that you're talking about were not assimilated, and so that would be useful. I think probably the problem is that these different data sets are in disparate locations, so finding them and then using them takes some effort, but that's a good idea. Thanks, Ed.
Okay, thanks a lot, Chris. Janet, are you up for moving on to a new question, or do you want to?
Yes, definitely. So I think maybe we'll talk a bit about the system components. The different mix of platforms, and as part of the task team, we'd like to talk about about the essential ocean variables rather than the platforms. So let's think about it in terms of that. So, for instance, you know, the coffee ship array has played an extremely important role in the long-term collection of data, and especially the BGC data, as well as the stratification data, temperature and salinity and underway velocity measurements. But gliders have gone a long way recently to replacing the CTD measurements, I'm guessing, as part of the cow-coffee array. But can you talk a bit about the new technologies, such as gliders, progressively replacing the more traditional ways of observing? And then perhaps, if you feel up to it, a little bit about what new technology is being developed and deployed in terms of BGC sampling, because the shipboard measurements are obviously critical to taking many of the nutrients and other measurements. Thanks, Kasia.
Yes.
We'll start with you.
Sure. I don't necessarily think of gliders as replacing the shipboard measurements of cow coffee, for example. I think of them as filling in the gaps, maybe, where cow coffee goes out 4 times a year, but we have a very strong seasonal cycle in the CCS, and so you can imagine you wouldn't necessarily capture it very well going out only 4 times a year. So that's where the gliders are very useful. Is you get a section every 2 weeks, and so you can fill in the gaps between those ship surveys pretty well with the autonomous platform. And I also don't think that gliders will replace shipboard measurements like cow coffee, because there are some things that we won't be able to do. the in situ biological, bottle sample type of measurements that they do are incredibly important. And gliders can't do that now, and I don't know that they'll be able to do that with incredibly high fidelity for a long time. So yeah, I think they're complementary. I think the gliders do very well at the basic hydrography and physics and filling in the gaps of that, but cow coffee is essential to doing the biological survey component of these assessments.
Thanks, Kasia. And maybe, Chris, you can speak to it from a model perspective. I've lost Uber's questions. I've lost his question, but I understand it was related to how the models, what data sets the models like to assimilate, and also, can you speak a little bit about the model, the biogeochemistry modeling in the region?
Thanks, Janet. So I didn't present this in the 5-minute summary, but I did discuss it in the longer talk. Although the physical data assimilation is most mature, there is a lot of work going on globally on biogeochemical data assimilation, and we're one of the groups that do that. It's just the same as the physical assimilation, except that the statistics of the biogeochemical data is non-Gaussian, and that does alter the procedure a little bit through the addition of a transformation to make it more Gaussian and to allow it to fit within the theory for 40 var, say. And here's just a demonstration of that for surface chlorophyll. We use this model on the lower left, which is an 11-box biogeochemical model. It goes by the name Nemero. And over on the right is a demonstration of assimilation of chlorophyll estimates from satellite. And I won't go into the details here. The point is that we can do this, but there's an incredibly sparse amount of data that if we think there are gaps in the physics, the physics is so well covered compared to the biogeochemical components. So I think this is still very early in this process. Out of 11 boxes in this particular model, we're measuring at the surface the sum of 2 of them. And there are others that are critically important, as have been mentioned, the nutrients. And I think as gliders begin measuring those, as Argo platforms are now measuring the nutrients, at least some of them, I think this is going to significantly improve our ability to do these state estimates. So I think the models can help fill in the gaps for things we don't know, but we also don't know enough to know. We're probably improving some fields and worsening others, and are not really sure at this time because of the lack of observations. But progress in this area is very exciting and moving forward well.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks, Kasia. Janet, just as a time check, we're at 35 minutes past the hour. I thought maybe we could switch on to some of the audience or attendee submitted questions. And so I think this last question is a great segue into the first attendee submitted question, which is a more general discussion. Is that, you know, gliders are good at capturing spatial and low frequency temporal variability. Moorings are better at high frequency temporal processes. What's the best step towards merging that? And then, is assimilation ready for point data like moored time series? And I guess this is a question more for you, Chris.
I think assimilation is ready for it, but because of the way assimilation works, an observation at a particular point, let's see, I'm trying to find a good figure for this. Anyway, an observation at a particular point in the model influences a portion of the model over some decorrelation scale. And for our model, we use something like 30 kilometers laterally, which is, you know, a fraction of the mesoscale length scale. Near shore filaments, submesoscale variability is quite a bit smaller and makes assimilation of that information on that's varying on high temporal frequencies quite challenging. And it might be that we're just assimilating noise in our model at those high frequencies. So to say whether we're ready for it or not, I think the models can do it, but the impact of point measurements is limited. Where you really get a lot of impact to the model is with spatially extended pieces of information, and that's why I've emphasized the Argo network, the gliders, and the satellite products here, and the HF radar. So generally, we've used the point measurements for evaluation, but they can be assimilated. They just don't change the model very much.
So just as a follow-up question, I can't help myself here, but you'd mentioned, you know, how nice it is to have spatially distributed data like gliders. You know, there's a lot of sensors that are now being incorporated into gliders. What sensor do you think would be nicest or the coolest thing to have on gliders? And then I guess, Kasia, you can comment on whether it's a sensor that has the potential to be you know, put on gliders operationally. And so, for example, I could think, you know, people are starting to put UV nitrate sensors on gliders. Is that the coolest thing to have, or would it be something else, for example?
Yeah, so from a physics point of view, I would say the best thing we can do is deploy more gliders. That the gliders are fantastic. When we do a calculation of the impact of observations, the satellites, of course, overwhelmingly have the largest volume of data. But if you look at the impact on assimilation state estimates per observation, the in situ temperature and salinity is the most impactful. So I would recommend more gliders rather than a new physical sensor on the glider. If we move to biogeochemistry, I do think the nutrients are the next step, and the nitrate sensors, I guess, are coming along and will become routine. Of course, that's just one nutrient. Silicate would be great too, but I don't think that's even on the horizon right now. And then in the biogeochemistry, I think we have very limited information on the zooplankton fields. So I don't even know what that would be, whether it would be acoustic or some other sensor. But that's something in the biogeochemistry that we just have very little information about in a near real-time sense.
And do you want to comment on that, Kasia, in terms of sensors that are coming online for gliders?
Yeah. I'm sure many of you know that there is an ongoing effort right now to create a BGC Argo float. Today at the instrument development group at Scripps, that is what they're working on. And so the same people working on that float are also the same people who work on the spray glider. So you can imagine a similar sensor suite in time as the BGC Argo float, which does include things like PAR, I believe, and nitrate, among others. So yeah, I think it's in the works. I think sensor integration is hard, and there's a lot of effort that goes into validation, which is, again, where ships and gliders or floats are complementary, right? Where as you integrate new sensors onto a float or a glider, you need something to compare it to that's historical to see if it makes sense. But yeah, that is ongoing work, and I think the BGC suite is moving towards autonomous platforms as we speak.
Thank you. Janet, do you want to move on to the next attendee?
Yes, it's a two-part question from Juliana Burden, and she asks, I would like to ask Chris what data uses to assimilate SSH into the model. Does it use the grid altimeter data or just the data along tracks, and what missions are primarily used?
Excellent question, and it depends on the modeled product. So different modeling groups use different satellite platforms and even satellite levels. So, for example, the UCSC group assimilates level 4 information, so it's gridded, and we constructed that early on for routine availability of information that spanned our whole domain. The Oregon State group, led by Alex Karapov, who's now at NOAA and leading the WCOFS group, use a long track altimetry. And there are advantages to that. Actually, what's particularly useful, as Alex has shown, is it's the gradient of the along track information that can really constrain the assimilative product. And so in the Oregon State version, they assimilate differences in the along track altimeter information. So different groups are doing different things. We find the routine coverage of the gridded product is helpful for maintaining sort of a similar impact cycle to cycle of the satellite altimeter, but as I say, other groups are doing a long track pieces of information. And if you ask me which satellite platforms are being used, I can't tell you what's being used in WCOFS. I think 3 SST sensors, and I really don't know the SSH sensor, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, that's great. And the second part to that question is she'd like to know how many ensemble members were used and how was that number determined?
If you're asking about the ensemble, we actually don't perform ensemble common filter calculations. So we're not running ensembles. We run a single 4-dimensional variational assimilation system where in the ENKF, you need the ensembles to estimate error covariances and a mean state of your ensemble. In the 40 var methodology, you just have a single trajectory, and you use the tangent, linear, and adjoint models to calculate a gradient of the cost function, which tells you the directions to go in your control vector space to improve it. So anyway, so we run one system, and we run typically about 10 or 20 loops of that, which is a little bit similar to ensemble calculations. So we minimize a cost function 10 or 20 times, depending on the configuration. And most ensemble systems that I'm familiar with are running that order of, 20, 25 sort of ensemble members. But that's not what we're doing or anyone else on the West Coast, as far as I know.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Ed.
Thanks. I just wanted to say there's a quick follow-up from Uwe on the earlier discussion we had about surface heat fluxes, pointing out that the California current moorings have a number of shortwave radiation sensors on them, or irradiance sensors at different wavelengths to which you could construct an incoming shortwave proxy, and that data set goes back 10 years and might be of interest, and that he's happy to collaborate. The next question that we have here is from Ted Strube, and it's many of the ecological questions asked are Lagrangian in nature. For example, where do unusual plankton populations come from during normal or anomalous periods? Are there Lagrangian observing techniques that could be put in place to verify the answers to these questions that we get from models, and not just kind of going beyond surface drifters? And I guess I'm going to take that question and run with it a little bit, Kasia, and ask, I guess I'm aware of some work that people are starting to do with gliders that they're trying to build some a little bit of onboard smarts into them that they could sniff out, for example, a high chlorophyll area, and maybe try to follow that high chlorophyll area. Anyway, are you aware of whether it's gliders or autonomous vehicles or some kind of a smart drifter that that people are thinking about in terms of getting at some of these Lagrangian observing techniques?
Yeah, people are definitely thinking about that sort of kind of smart automated onboard control with gliders. That's not what the California Underwater Glider Network does. That's just routine sampling back and forth to figure out averages and monitor signals as they happen. But yeah, certainly, I think there's work being done. For example, if you detect a front, go back and sample that front at high resolution type of work is ongoing. That's a lot of engineering work to build a glider that can do that type of self-control, but I think people are working on it.
Okay, thanks very much. I guess, and is that the kind of, so I take your point about, there's sort of two ways of doing unbiased sampling, either random sampling or uniform sampling. And on some level, if you want to establish an ongoing network, you're kind of doing your best in many cases to make sure that it's a relatively uniform, repeated sampling. Having said that, Chris, in terms of modeling, are these types of process studies, quasi-Lagrangian process studies, is that one sort of additional modeling validation that would be interesting to do, or is it just kind of out there at this point?
There is work that's gone on the East Coast to try to assimilate Lagrangian data, and actually it's showing some real promise. This is in the Maracus area, and so the data could be used for evaluation or for data constraints. Perhaps I'll run with Ted's question in a different direction, that the model could be used to help answer some of the questions that are Lagrangian in nature. So I really don't know enough about the potential observations to get at what you're asking, but I do wonder about very light light sensors that can be deployed rapidly in large volumes to represent smaller organisms. But a different approach would be to take the model output and to integrate virtual larvae or virtual floats. And that is happening routinely with non-data assimilative models, and it's starting to happen with data assimilative models. So I think your point about what people really care about are source waters. You know, from some biological questions, what people care about is where the water came from and where it is going. And those things, I think, could use the data assimilative models very effectively to answer those. And one could think about metrics that would define source waters and propagate them through the already data constrained system.
Thank you. Do you want to ask we've got one more question.
May I add one more quick comment?
Oh yes, yeah, sure.
I was just going to say that gliders and floats, because they're buoyancy driven, are actually pretty well suited for, you know, vertical tracking, for example, isopycnal or isotherm type of tracking, as opposed to lateral tracking. And so I guess that's somewhat Lagrangian in one dimension. But yeah, just something to consider with the type of autonomous platforms that we have.
So are you thinking, are there ways that people are thinking about to send a glider on a mission, for example, where it would adjust its buoyancy to follow a certain isopycnal for a length of time and act as kind of a programmable float? Okay.
Yeah, that's being done.
Oh, very cool. Okay, thank you. And I guess I guess it wouldn't necessarily require a glider. If you could do the same thing, I guess, with a drifter. It would be, or could you do the same thing with a drifter, or you know, kind of program it to follow at one particular isopycnal? Okay.
I think it would take two-way communication. I think Rayphos floats, for example, are more built for doing that.
Are there examples of very lightweight drifters that are much cheaper, or floats that are much cheaper that could be deployed for some of the Lagrangian problems? I mean, a glider is a very expensive instrument for this type of analysis. Are there effectively passive drones that have some communication capability but are tiny, and you could deploy hundreds or something like that?
If there aren't, that's a great idea.
Yeah, I'm not aware of. I guess what I think about is I know people have made inexpensive surface drifters and probably deployed them in the dozens. I'm not aware of anybody that's deployed drifters in the hundreds, right? I think, you know, on shorter timescales, people have done dye injection studies. Well, if it's far enough offshore that you can follow that patch of dye for years, they've certainly done, you know, dye injection studies. On short timescales, coastal current timescales, I think people have followed patches of dye for sort of periods of up to about a week in the California current. Maybe there's somebody that's followed them for a little bit longer than that. But I think in a pretty energetic boundary system, it'll disperse pretty quickly. But I guess that's something I haven't seen a lot of. I haven't seen recent dye studies. Most of the ones that I'm aware of are 10 or 15 years old at this point. Do we want to go ahead and ask the final submitted question from Nadia, Janet?
Yes, if I can find my screen again. Here it is. Oh. Okay, no, I got it. Nadia Ayoub asks about the design of the observations network, either from a routine or more occasional perspective. She wants to know, is there any initiative based on the adjoint sensitivity method? Loaded question.
Does that mean, so something, Chris, you had talked about in your talk was doing these assessments to figure out what the optimal kind of sampling scheme might be for a model. Is that what the question is?
I think the question was asking if any of these observation impact studies or OSSIs, as are done in other areas, are altering the observation network. And I'm not aware of any instances where observations have been deployed specifically as the result of these studies. You know, I think it will happen over time at some point. We're involved, for example, right now in an impact study where we're trying to assess the observation network for ocean acidification. And it takes quite a long time to do these calculations the first time, and I don't expect a new observation program to go in based on those results immediately. But over time, if you do these sorts of calculations and identify gaps in either the sensors or in the location, I think the observation network may adjust in a modest way.
Mm-hmm.
It is kind of funny. I would say, as an observationalist, it seems like a crying shame that we've been talking about OSSIs for a long time, but when the rubber hits the road and observation networks are designed, it tends to be several observationalists, you know, holding their thumb up and squinting as to where to put these things. And a lot of times it's based on where we've historically taken observations, because just like the old joke goes, with the time series, there's two mistakes. One of them is starting a time series and the other one is ending it. And then, you know, sometimes it's based on logistical considerations. Where can we get to for cheap? And so those are difficult, but I agree that we've kind of failed to use the power of these sensitivity studies too many times in the past. And this seems like, as you say, we're moving into an era where we're trying to understand things like ocean acidification. This is a time, again, that's ripe to think about that stuff.
Yeah, I'll just mention one more thing. I think it's very hard because the OSSI results or our impact results will depend on exactly what question you ask. So I'm showing results here for 37 North Transport, but someone who's focused on a different region may have a very different question. It might have to do with eddy kinetic energy or overall meridional heat transport, and then the observation network is different. So in trying to use these pieces of information, you also have to agree on what question you're going after, and that can be fraught with debate.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks very much, Chris. We're just about at the end of the hour here. We've got just a couple minutes left. I've started sharing my screen. I just wanted to point out we've got several more upcoming dialogues about integrated observing and forecasting boundary systems coming up. And you can just go to the Goose ocean.org website and then find the webinars and click on the full kind of story. But they're basically the first Tuesday of the month coming up over the next 4 months. The next one is going to be on Corshio, and you can see that they're at different times, and those times are kind of focused on trying to attract the greatest number of people that are interested in that particular system geographically. So you can see the next couple are coming up at 0800 UTC. But please do consider joining us for the next series of dialogues, and even if you can't make it to the live presentation, you can register, view the videos, and I think we are trying to record these presentations and make them available via the Goose website. So I want to take the opportunity again to thank Forrest, Belen, and Marjolaine for organizing these series of talks. Thank Kasia and Chris and for presenting the talks, and thank you, Janet, for moderating.
Thank you, Ed, for moderating.
All right. Well, we're just about 1 minute away, and again, we'll look forward to hearing from folks. If you want to reach out to us, you can find my email or or whatnot online and provide feedback. And again, we'll log the questions and the talks here. So, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Forrest, I'll let you wrap things